Designed to carry 8,000 tons, nearly twice the cargo ever moved under sail, the seven-masted steel schooner Thomas W. Lawson was referred to as a maritime error of colossal proportions, and as a dramatic and senseless freak built more for size and advertising than for successful trading and ultimate profit. It was also insinuated that she was built largely to gratify the vanity of her chief financial backer, Thomas Lawson. A successful Boston businessman, Tom Lawson was a well-known, some said notorious, stock market operator. He had made his considerable fortune speculating in copper. At the time of the Lawsons' building, he was president of the Bay State Gas Company. The Coastwise Transportation Company, on the other hand, builders of the Lawson, was a little-known company that operated a small fleet of coastal steamers, a schooner, and one barge. Its president, Captain John F. Crowley, had considered the possibility of building a large sailing bulk carrier for some time before he and Lawson came together to build the supership. The well-known naval architect B.B. Crowninshield, whose work had contributed to more seaworthy designs for the Gloucester fishing fleet, was named as designer of the vessel, and a contract was given to the Four River Ship and Engine Building Company, and work began in 1901. Even before sliding down the ways on July 10, 1902 at Quincy, Massachusetts, the Lawson was well known. A deep, narrow vessel, she carried her great waterline length of 368 feet on only 50 feet of beam. She had 3 steel decks throughout her length and 6 cargo hatches feeding holds 35 feet deep. Fully loaded, she drew 25.5 feet. Her most dramatic feature, apart from her immense size, was her 7-masted fore and aft rig. The masts, 193 feet tall, were of the height reached in the California Clippers half a century earlier, but seemed dwarfed by the size of the ship. Each was made up of a steel lower mast surmounted by a 58-foot topmast of Oregon pine. Rigged as a schooner with 4 jibs and a staysail, the Lawson is supposed to have carried 43,000 square feet of sail, almost an acre. Although old photographs show her with both topsails and topmast staysails, these were in fact seldom set, and later on were done away with altogether. The hundreds of iron mast hoops made a distinctive rattling as the ship rolled in a beam sea. The Lawson was once described by the coxswain of a Cornish lifeboat as being as long as from here to next week, and there is a persistent legend that her masts were named for the days of the week. However, the legend is denied in a terse and unequivocal letter written in 1932 by one of her captains, Arthur L. Crowley. This letter, still in the files of the Peabody Museum at Salem, states that the masts were called fore, main, mizzen, number 4, number 5, number 6, and spanker. The Lawson was highly mechanized. She had 7 deck engines for handling sails, cargo, and for pumping the ship. To provide steam for these engines, there were 2 separate boiler rooms with horizontal stacks. The boilers not only heated the crew's living quarters, but also ran a generator for electric light, which at the time was a luxury known only to steamers. The ship was also equipped with a 60-horsepower steam steering engine, as well as a powerful windlass, also run by steam. Unlike the average sailing vessel whose donkey engine was only for occasional use, the Lawson's steam plant was as essential as a steamer's engine. It was only by means of this auxiliary power that the enormous vessel could be steered and her heavy gear and sails handled. The company claimed that these contrivances saved them the wages of 20 seamen. The Lawson sailed with a crew of only 16, one of whom was a deck engineer. The crew were paid about $35 a month, which apparently was not enough to attract and keep experienced sailors. New hands were carried on nearly every trip, many of whom were not even qualified able seamen. In spite of the power of her 2 boilers, the Lawson depended completely on her sails for propulsion. She was difficult to handle under canvas, being sluggish and unwieldy. Her high bow would sometimes catch the wind and prevent her coming about. When this happened, she would be forced to wear around, or, if there was not sea room enough, to anchor. Intended for the coal trade between Virginia and New England ports, it was soon found that the Lawson was too large and awkward for coastal work, her deep draft preventing her from using the smaller harbors. It was also realized too late that her schooner rig, with its excessive chafe and liability to jibe, made her unsuited for long passages over the world's great trade routes. One wonders, with the wisdom of hindsight, how these obvious facts had escaped her owners as well as her designer, Mr. Crowninshield. After a few years as a coal carrier, the Lawson was fitted with wooden bulkheads and converted to carry oil in bulk. She made regular runs between the Delaware River and Sabine Pass, Texas, often being towed by the powerful tug Paul Jones. The Lawson carried a huge amount of water ballast in her double bottoms and once turned over when being loaded and was only righted with great difficulty. Previously, she had nearly rolled over at Newport News, but was held up by her wire spring lines. In 1907, the Coastwise Transportation Company, which by then had built another ship, the six-masted William L. Douglas, turned the Lawson over to the Sun Oil Company on a 5-year charter. On November 19th of that year, she left Philadelphia for London with a cargo of over 2 million gallons of engine oil. The captain, George Dow, was from Hancock, Maine, and the crew included men from Scandinavia, Russia, Germany, Austria, and an Englishman, Edward Rowe, also from Maine, ran the deck machinery. The ship encountered a gale off Newfoundland, closely followed by another storm worse than the first. Fully loaded, the Lawson had been described as a half-tide rock never clear of the sweeping seas. And before long, she had lost both her lifeboats together with her one life raft. Even under bare poles, the ship still made over 12 knots, as the wind got behind her, huge spars and hull pushing her eastward. Unable to get a sight, Captain Dow had no clear idea of his position, and it was not until the afternoon of December 13th, after 25 days at sea, that land was finally sighted. By this time, although the weather moderated, the Lawson was reduced to only 6 usable sails and could not be maneuvered so as to clear the land. By letting go both anchors and 250 tons of chain, the crew managed to stop their ship only half a mile from the outlying reefs of the Scilly Isles, a group of low-lying islands some 40 miles off the coast of Cornwall. Often shrouded in fog, their position athwart the main shipping lanes had made them a source of anxiety to the masters of passing vessels since Phoenician times. Even in clear weather, strong currents make the approaches dangerous, and for centuries the inhabitants have made a precarious living by piloting and smuggling and plundering the unnumbered wrecks for which a pilot came too late. When a large American vessel with 7 masts was seen anchored in an exposed place off Annet Island, the 2 local lifeboats were immediately dispatched, although no distress signals had been seen. A lifeboat reached the Lawson about 5 p.m., but the coxswain could get no answer, so he approached the ship under oars with the intention of persuading the captain to slip his cables and run his ship to a place of safety. Captain Dow, however, secure in the knowledge of his huge anchors, only asked that tugs be summoned from Falmouth 90 miles away, meanwhile accepting the services of Trinity House pilot William Hicks. One lifeboat stood by, but as the weather worsened, it could not risk staying out longer and returned to the harbor, promising to keep a good lookout for a signal of distress. From then on, events moved to their inevitable conclusion, and even years later, the engineer Rowe was reluctant to speak about what happened. The gale continued to increase, and as the seas began sweeping over the ship, the crew climbed into the rigging. The port anchor chain parted about 1:15 a.m., and the ship began dragging slowly towards the rocks. After the other chain broke an hour later, it was only a matter of minutes before the ship struck the Hellweather's Reef broadside on. She broke in two almost immediately, both halves turning over and sinking. The pilot and officers had lashed themselves to the mizzen rigging, and when the masts went over the side, Rowe managed to jump clear. He was immediately swept overboard and found himself in the water, holding on to a piece of bulkhead timber, buffeted by the waves and completely covered in heavy oil. The captain also managed to get clear, and both men were eventually flung onto Hellweather's Rock some distance away. From the shore, a watch had been kept all night. When the lights were seen to go out about 3 a.m., it was at first thought that the ship had slipped her cables and cleared the island. But dawn showed the Lawson on her side, fast being broken up by the huge seas. The inquest, held 3 days later at the principal town of St. Mary's, was fully reported by the London Times. Only Edward Rowe was able to testify, the other survivor, Captain Dow, being too badly injured to appear. The coroner's report concluded, in the stilted language of the courtroom, that everything possible had been done to save the ship, and no blame could be attached to anyone. If it had really been a question of blame, those responsible for sending the Lawson off on her final voyage should certainly have been called to testify. The Lawson's deficiencies are so obvious, and her ending so dramatic, that it is easy to dismiss her as an outlandish freak and forget that in terms of human and mechanical energy, she was extraordinarily efficient. To move over 8,000 tons of cargo with no mechanical propulsion and only 17 men is still something of a feat. Nor was she a failure financially. She paid dividends of 66% of her cost in her first 3 years of operation.